So today we're going to be looking at some more causes of the Civil War. For today, we're going to be looking at expansion, the idea of how westward expansion and the growth of the country and the arguments over slavery in these new states led to the Civil War. The nation had really tried to ignore the issue of slavery, particularly in the Constitutional Convention when they were coming up with the idea of the Constitution and the new government. The only time they mentioned slaves was in the Three-Fifths Compromise. The rest of the time, they made no idea of what to do with new states and whether the expansion of the nation would new states, new territories be slave states or free states. So this kind of really becomes a complicated issue as the country begins to expand. So really, there had been kind of unwritten rules of slavery. It was kind of the free states were in the north. You see here the blue states, and the slavery was in the south. You see the southern states. And this is kind of unspoken rules of where slavery was firmly in place. But as I said, as the country begins to expand, when they start to add those territories in the westward expansion, compromises the new territories challenge the rules and kind of threaten northerners and southerners. For a long time, as you can see, it was a tie actually between the amount of states, the free states, and the amount of slave states. It was 11 states to 11 states. So that meant that Congress of the nation was equally divided between slave and free states. This was the case up and through the 1820s. So it had equal influence on laws and policies of the nation. So it kind of equaled each other out. Westward expansion really changed the balance between this. As the country is expanding, the idea of would new territories, new states be slave states or free states? One aspect of this is that it is physically impossible to grow cotton in most of the territory west of the Mississippi River. We learned that wheat and corn grow well there, but cotton grows better in the hot, humid South. So really, the cotton industry is based on slavery, so that becomes part of it. But this really becomes an area where conflict between the free states and the southern states begins to build. They had to figure out ways of compromise when they were admitting new states to the territory, to the United States. And so what happened is with the purchase of Louisiana Territory, they had the Missouri Compromise of 1820. What this did was, you see the A there, the state of Missouri was admitted as a slave state, and then the state of Maine was added to the Union as a free state. So this equaled out you add a new slave state, you add a new free state. This also set the latitude line of 3630 that divided the line between slave states and free states. So what you see here is another depiction of the Missouri Compromise. So you see the A there, that is Missouri. So that is admitted as a slave state. The red line you see is the 3630 lines. This line is going to extend all the way to the end of the country. At this point, the end of the country is the Rocky Mountains. Remember, Texas and the Southwest Territory, the California Territory is part of Mexico. And so you see everything below that 3630 line, that C there, that is a slave territory. Everything above it, the B, is free territory. So at this point up to 1820, you can see how the Missouri Compromise kind of affected slave states and free states. The expansion of the country into the Southwest Territory and the California Territory, we get the Compromise of 1850. This is a compromise dealing with slave states and free states. So what happens is California is admitted to the Union as a free state, and Utah and New Mexico territories get to choose for themselves whether they're going to be a free state or a slave state. This is the idea of popular sovereignty. They have the right to choose on their own. This also brought about the Fugitive Slave Act. So that meant the Fugitive Slave Act was the idea that slaves could be captured, runaway slaves could be captured in free states and brought back to their owners in slave states. So the problem with this, though, is they're not ID at the times. A lot of African Americans, black people, are being captured and brought back to the South. So this kind of creates a lot of conflict on the idea of free states and slave states, but also the idea that Southerners kind of feel cheated by this too. While they can get their slaves back from free states, California is admitted, and then Utah and New Mexico get to choose on their own. So they feel like that things are kind of going against them. Another map of the Compromise of 1850. You can see California there, the A is admitted as a free state, but you see Southern California, as you go down, a lot of the territory in California is in the South. It's parallel with Atlanta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, North Carolina. So the idea that all of California is admitted as a free state upsets a lot of Southerners. But then you also see B, which is the Utah territory, and C, which is the New Mexico territory. These two states get to decide if they're going to be slave states or not based on the idea of popular sovereignty. They have the right to vote in their states. But you see up here, northern Utah territory is parallel with places like Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York City. And so this is really in the north. So this is for the northerners. This is why do they get to decide if they want to be a slave state? They're in the north. So this is really kind of bringing the issue of slave states and free states to a head. Why it is a compromise? The Compromise of 1850 really angers everyone. The North is angry about the Fugitive Slave Act, the idea that Southern bounty hunters can go into northern states and capture African Americans, capture quote unquote escaped slaves and bring them out of their territory into free states. Upsets a lot of Northerners. The South is upset about California. Like I showed you, a lot of California sits below southern latitudes, but they are admitted as a free state. And then both regions are kind of bitter at the idea of popular sovereignty in New Mexico and Utah. As I showed you, both territories sit, New Mexico sits predominantly in the South. Utah, a lot of the territories in the northern territories. So this upsets everybody. So the idea of the Transcontinental Railroad really kind of affects these ideas of slave states and free states because as you're looking at the expansion of the railroad, they want to connect California to the East Coast. The idea of where they're going to put the railroad, where is it going to go through? Because wherever the railroad goes through, it's really going to help those territories. So the Gadsden Purchase here, the United States purchases territory in southern Arizona and New Mexico, the area you see there in yellow. And what this does is the South thinks this is a good route for the Transcontinental Railroad. They think that the railroad could go through this territory connecting California to a city like New Orleans or to a city like St. Louis in Missouri, both slave states. However, Stephen Douglas, a senator from Illinois, wants to take a northern route with the Transcontinental Railroad. He wants the Transcontinental Railroad to go to Chicago because this would greatly benefit Chicago. So the idea of where the railroad is going to go complicates matters even more. So here you can see the route of the Transcontinental Railroad from Chicago to San Francisco. But the problem is with the territories of Kansas and Nebraska, to build the railroad, it has to be built in a state. It can't be built in a territory. This is the law that was laid out. But you can see with the Missouri Compromise, the territories of Nebraska and Kansas would be admitted as free states. So the South opposes this. The South does not want to add any additional free states because it will throw off the balance of power in the Congress, in the country. And so Stephen Douglas is really struggling with how to be able to get the Transcontinental Railroad to go to Chicago through these territories to get these territories admitted as states so he could build the railroad there. So what happens is the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854. This effectively repeals the Missouri Compromise. What this means is that Kansas and Nebraska can now choose for themselves to become slave or free states. The idea here, again, as with New Mexico and Utah, is the idea of popular sovereignty. The people in the states have the right to decide what those states are going to do. Of course, this is going to upset the balance of power. It's going to upset the South because they're losing that. Southerners and Northerners in Congress do vote through the Kansas-Nebraska Act based on the argument made by Stephen Douglas. Basically, Douglas argues that if you look at the Missouri Compromise, how it would have stood, these states would have been admitted as free states based on the 3630 line. Both states are above that. So Kansas and Nebraska would have been admitted as free states. So he says that if there's popular sovereignty, these states might vote for be slave states. Likely what happens is Kansas you can grow cotton in the southern regions of Kansas. So the idea is that Southerners might have a chance of getting Kansas. Of course, Nebraska is not going to vote to be a slave state, but what he sells to the North is the idea that this is a bigger territory. There will be more states in this territory, and it also sells to the Northerners that they will now get the Transcontinental Railroad going to Chicago. So that guarantees the income, guarantees the prestige, the business from that. So this is how he's able to sell the Kansas-Nebraska Act. But Northerners feel cheated by this act. So this is a quote from a congressman following the passage of the bill. He says, "We arranged this bill as a gross violation of a sacred pledge, as a criminal betrayal of precious rights, As part and parcel of an atrocious plot to exclude from a vast unoccupied region immigrants from the Old World and free laborers from our own states, and convert it into a dreary region of despotism inhabited by masters and slaves. Basically, what they're saying is this is going to be a slave territory. This is not the ideas of the American Republic. This is not what we want to stand for. We don't want to admit slave states like that. So they're really feeling upset about the idea that Kansas might become a slave state. The Kansas-Nebraska Act is supposed to be a compromise similar to the Compromise of 1850, and it's supposed to please both Southerners and Northerners, free states and slave states. But what happens is it kind of spills over as Kansas is trying to decide what they want to do. It spills over into conflict, in the conflict known as Bleeding Kansas. This is a conflict that occurs in the mid-1850s, 1856, and Northerners and Southerners responded violently to each other. You get the term Beecher's Bibles. This is what abolitionists, pro-free state mobs refer to. They refer to their guns as Beecher's Bibles, based on Henry Ward Beecher, who was a famous New England abolitionist. You also get the conflict known as the Sacking of Lawrence. This is in 1856, when pro-slavery activists attacked and ransacked the town of Lawrence, Kansas, which had been founded by anti-slavery settlers from Massachusetts who were hoping to make Kansas a free state. In response to this, you get the Potawatomi Massacre. This was led by the famous or infamous abolitionist John Brown and a band of his family members and other abolitionists, and they attacked a group of pro-slavery forces. They were abolitionists responding to Kansas, and killed 5 people. As a result of this, you can see this is really spilling over. The idea of free states and slave states is spilling over into open violence in Bleeding Kansas. Here's a depiction of the sacking of Lawrence in 1856. You can see people rampaging the street, killing each other. You see a man hanging. You can see just open murder and mayhem based on the idea these are pro-slavery forces coming into Kansas, which is a town coming into Lawrence, which is a town settled by anti-slavery people from Massachusetts. You can see the open murder and the death caused by that. Here you can see a depiction of John Brown following the sacking of Lawrence at the Potawatomi Massacre. This is when Brown led abolitionist forces, anti-slavery forces against pro-slavery forces, and killed 5 people. And is basically a response following what happened in Lawrence. So you can see it is bleeding over. The idea of Bleeding Kansas is turning into open conflict. You can see the depiction here of John Brown, larger than life, standing up for the forces of the anti-slavery movement. As a result of the conflict of Bleeding Kansas and the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Republican Party is born. And here you see Abraham Lincoln, who was the first Republican president, probably the most famous early Republican. And the whole goal of the Republican Party is to stop the spread of slavery. They basically base a platform on stopping the admittance of slave states to the Union. One of the more famous cases in Supreme Court history is the Dred Scott case in 1857. This is a really important decision as we headed towards the Civil War, dealing with expansion, dealing with slavery. So what happened is Dred Scott was a slave who was taken from Missouri, his home state, which was a slave state, to the Missouri Territory, which had been authorized as a free territory due to the Missouri Compromise. Then Scott was brought back to Missouri with his slave owner, and Scott sued for his peace, basically saying that I've been to a free territory, I am now free, I should be free. And the Supreme Court ruled against Scott, basically said that he was still a slave since he had been a slave, and basically said that African Americans were not citizens and had no rights. Congress could not regulate or limit slavery. And what this more importantly did was basically make slavery technically legal everywhere. That meant that no matter where you went, if you were brought back to a slave territory, you were still a slave. The North is really shocked by the Dred Scott decision. And what they think is happening, they think it's a conspiracy against the free states. They think that the southern states are trying to gain more power through the Supreme Court. They believe that the South wanted to spread slavery everywhere. And Abraham Lincoln is quoting that the Supreme Court is trying to make Illinois a slave state. And he actually immediately challenged the verdict in the courts. But what this really shows is that things are really coming to a hold, really boiling over with the conflict between free states and slave states. John Brown's raid had a similar effect on southern states. Remember, we had already talked about John Brown, but he was the famous or infamous abolitionist, militant abolitionist, who led a series of raids in 1859 in the South in hopes of sparking a slave rebellion throughout the South. And this convinced Southerners that the North no longer respected the old rules about slavery, that Northerners were going to come in and try to get the slaves to revolt, that there is a conspiracy, that there is a militant attempt to overtake the South, overtake their way of life. What has happened in all this is basically westward expansion and the expansion of the United States had eliminated the traditional borders between free states and slave states, between the North and the South, which had existed into 1820, and the 11 states on each side had equaled each other out. And so what happens is Northerners and Southerners are becoming paranoid as the borders between these states have disappeared, as these conflicts have happened in Kansas, as the Dred Scott case. Northerners see the Dred Scott cases. Basically, slave owners are going to take their slaves wherever they want to take them in the Union. And then, Southerners see John Brown's rebellion as, the free states are going to come in and overthrow slavery in the North. So both sides became convinced the other side intended to spread and expand. And this really changed the nature of the conflict from slavery to survival. So it goes from being in conflict over slavery to the idea that the other side is trying to overthrow the institution and overthrow your way of life, or bring the institution of slavery into your territory and overthrow your way of life. So it really goes from something way more extreme. And this is what's going to lead to the Civil War.